I didn't plan to walk that night, not really, but sleep wasn't coming and the apartment felt too small, too aware of me, and when I checked the time it was just after 12:30 a.m., the hour when the city seems to hold its breath, and I told myself a short walk might quiet my thoughts even though I already felt uneasy about stepping outside so late. The air smelled like old rain when I opened the building door, not fresh or clean, just damp and tired, and the streetlight across the road flickered once before settling into a dull yellow glow that made the sidewalk look flatter than it should have, like a surface painted onto the night. I remember hesitating on the threshold, listening for something I couldn't name, maybe footsteps or a car or even a voice, but there was nothing except the distant hum of traffic far away, and the silence felt heavier than noise would have. I pulled my jacket tighter and stepped out, telling myself this was normal, that people walk at night all the time, but my heart was already beating a little faster than it should have, as if it knew something I didn't. The sidewalk looked ordinary at first, cracked concrete with dark lines where rainwater had settled earlier, and I focused on the sound of my shoes tapping lightly, trying to anchor myself to something familiar as I headed down the block. That was when I noticed the warmth, subtle at first, like heat left behind by the sun, which didn't make sense because it had rained and the night was cool, and I slowed my step without fully realizing why. I stopped and pressed the sole of my shoe down harder, feeling it through the thin rubber, a gentle warmth rising up, not hot, not burning, just wrong in a quiet way that made my stomach tighten. I told myself it had to be underground pipes or something practical like that, even though I knew the pipes in this area didn't run under the sidewalk, and I started walking again, pretending the explanation was enough. With each step, the warmth stayed consistent, as if the ground itself was holding a steady temperature, and I became acutely aware of every place my foot touched, every transfer of weight, every soft press into something that felt almost alive. The street was empty in a way that felt deliberate, parked cars lining the curb like abandoned shells, their windows dark and unreadable, and I suddenly felt exposed, like I was the only moving thing in a frozen scene. I glanced behind me without stopping, half expecting to see someone else out walking, but the block was empty, stretching back into darkness, and the sense of being alone pressed closer around me. I tried to focus on practical details, the way the clouds hid the moon, the faint drip of water from a gutter somewhere, but the warmth underfoot kept pulling my attention back down, insisting on being noticed. As I reached the corner, I realized the warmth hadn't faded or changed, and when I stepped onto the next street, it continued seamlessly, as if the entire neighborhood shared the same quiet heat. I laughed softly to myself, the sound thin and unconvincing, because laughing felt safer than admitting I was scared, and the sound vanished too quickly, swallowed by the night. The further I walked, the more my thoughts began to loop, circling around the same questions without landing anywhere solid, and I started to feel like I was walking inside my own head. I checked my phone for the time again, 12:47 a.m., and noticed I had no notifications, no missed calls, nothing to prove anyone else was awake, and that made the street feel even emptier. I slowed down near a closed convenience store, its metal shutter pulled down tight, graffiti peeling at the edges, and when I stepped onto the concrete in front of it, the warmth intensified just slightly, enough to make me pause. I stood there, one foot lifted, afraid to put it down, and for a moment I imagined the sidewalk reacting to me. Responding in some small, imperceptible way, and the thought made my skin crawl. I placed my foot down anyway, feeling the warmth bloom again, steady and patient, and I wondered how long it had been like this, and why I had never noticed before. The silence deepened as I moved on, the city sounds retreating further into the distance, until it felt like I was walking through a pocket carved out of the night just for me. I became aware of my breathing, too loud in my ears, and tried to slow it, but every inhale felt shallow, every exhale uncertain, as if the air itself was watching me. The sidewalk began to look smoother somehow, the cracks less distinct, the texture blurred by shadow, and I found myself staring down constantly, afraid that if I looked up, something would change. At one point, I stopped completely and crouched down, pressing my palm against the concrete, telling myself this was ridiculous, but the warmth was there, undeniable, seeping into my skin in a way that felt intimate. I pulled my hand back quickly, my palm tingling, and wiped it against my jacket even though there was nothing on it, and the simple act felt like a small betrayal of my own fear. Standing up, I realized how quiet it was again, no cars, no voices, not even the wind, and the stillness felt stretched thin, like it might tear if I moved too suddenly. I considered turning back then, the idea forming slowly, but when I looked behind me, the street seemed longer than I remembered, the darkness deeper, and going back felt just as unsettling as continuing. So I kept walking, each step measured, my mind cataloging sensations obsessively, the warmth, the damp air, the faint ache in my legs, trying to ground myself in anything concrete. As I passed a row of apartment buildings, I noticed none of the windows were lit, which struck me as strange even for this hour, and I felt a sudden urge to knock on a door just to hear a human voice. I didn't, of course, because the idea of standing there alone, knocking on a dark door, felt worse than the silence, and I wondered when my thoughts had started to feel like traps. The warmth underfoot never wavered, and I began to imagine it spreading, slowly, quietly, reaching places it shouldn't, and the image made my chest feel tight. I told myself to count my steps, a simple distraction, but I kept losing track, my focus slipping away from numbers and back into unease. When I reached the small park at the end of the street, I hesitated at the entrance, the path curving away into darkness, the ground there also concrete, also warm, and the realization made my throat dry. The park benches were empty, their metal surfaces dark and wet, and the trees stood still, their leaves barely visible, and I felt like I was intruding somewhere I didn't belong. I took a few steps into the park, then stopped, overwhelmed by the sense that the warmth here was stronger, more concentrated, as if this place held onto it longer. I stood there, listening, convinced I could hear something beneath the silence, a low, steady presence that wasn't sound exactly, and the not sound made my ears ring. My thoughts drifted to childhood memories of pressing my ear to the ground, convinced I could hear the earth breathing, and the memory felt too close, too relevant. I backed away slowly, my heel catching slightly on the edge of the path, and the brief loss of balance sent a sharp jolt of panic through me. I turned around fully then, committing to going home, telling myself enough was enough, but as I retraced my steps, the sidewalk felt exactly the same, warm and unyielding. The walk back felt longer, my awareness stretched thin, every shadow feeling heavier, every parked car seeming closer, and I kept expecting something to break the pattern. Nothing did, and that was somehow worse, the consistency of it all pressing down on me like a question without an answer. When my building finally came into view, relief washed over me, thin but real, and I hurried the last few steps, my heart pounding for reasons I couldn't explain. At the door, I hesitated again, glancing down at the concrete one last time, the warmth still there, still waiting, and I felt a sudden, irrational guilt for leaving it. Inside, the building smelled like dust and old paint, familiar and safe, but my body didn't relax the way it should have, and my hands were still trembling slightly. I locked my apartment door and stood there in the dark, listening, half expecting to feel warmth through the floor, and when I didn't, the absence felt almost louder. I went to bed without turning on many lights, pulling the blanket up too high, my thoughts replaying the walk in slow, looping fragments that refused to settle. Lying there, I wondered if the sidewalk was still warm, if it always had been, if it would be again tomorrow night, and the unanswered questions kept me awake long after the rain started again outside. I first noticed her because she wasn't moving, and at that hour anything still feels wrong, especially near the corner where the streetlight flickers like it's tired of staying on, and I remember checking my watch out of habit even though I already knew it was late, sometime after 1 in the morning when the city starts pretending no one is watching. I had taken the same route home dozens of times before, the same narrow sidewalk, the same closed shops with metal shutters pulled tight, and I walked it without thinking most nights, but that night the air felt heavier, damp in a way that clung to my skin, and every sound seemed delayed, like it had to travel farther to reach me. She stood near the corner where the road bends slightly, half lit by the street lamp, and at first I thought she was waiting to cross, maybe checking her phone or listening for traffic, and I didn't think much of it until I realized she hadn't shifted her weight once. I slowed my pace without meaning to, my steps becoming quieter, and watched her from a distance, noticing how straight she stood, her arms relaxed at her sides, her head angled just enough that I couldn't see her face clearly. Something about her posture felt rehearsed, like she had been placed there and told not to move, and that thought made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't explain. I told myself people wait like that all the time, zoning out, lost in thought, but as I got closer, I realized there was something off about the space around her, like the air didn't quite touch her the same way it touched everything else. The streetlight above her buzzed softly, and its light cut a sharp circle on the pavement, and that was when I noticed the gap. Her feet were visible, shoes dark and ordinary, but they hovered just above the ground, no shadow connecting them, no contact with the concrete, and my first instinct was that my eyes were playing tricks on me. I stopped walking entirely, my foot hanging in the air for a moment before I set it down, and stared harder, blinking, shifting my angle slightly, hoping perspective would fix it. It didn't. She wasn't floating high, not dramatically, just enough that the gap existed, subtle and precise, like a mistake that hadn't been erased properly. My chest tightened, and I felt the sudden urge to cough or speak or make any noise at all, just to break whatever this was, but my throat stayed closed. I told myself there had to be an explanation: uneven pavement, a trick of the light, exhaustion messing with my depth perception, and I hated how reasonable those thoughts sounded and how little they helped. I became aware of how quiet everything was again, no passing cars, no distant voices, not even the usual hum of electricity, and the silence made her stillness feel louder. I took a cautious step forward, then another, my heart beating harder with each one, and she didn't react, didn't turn, didn't acknowledge me in any way. As I got closer, I noticed her clothes looked slightly out of place, not old-fashioned exactly, just wrong for the weather, a thin coat on a damp, chilly night, fabric hanging too neatly. I focused on her feet again, the small gap between sole and sidewalk refusing to close, and felt a wave of dizziness wash over me, like my balance depended on that contact existing. I wondered how long she had been standing there, how long anyone could stand that still, and whether she had been waiting for someone or something. The corner itself felt strange now, the painted lines on the road faded and dull, the curb darker than usual, and I had the unsettling thought that this intersection was holding its breath. I considered crossing the street to avoid her, the idea forming quickly and urgently, but when I glanced to the other side, the shadows there seemed deeper, less defined, and the choice didn't feel safer. I was close enough now to hear my own breathing clearly, and the sound felt intrusive, like I was disturbing something private. Her hair hung straight down her back, unmoving despite the faint breeze I could feel on my own face, and that detail stayed with me, quiet and wrong. I stood a few steps away, unsure what to do, my mind stuck between curiosity and fear, and the longer I stayed, the more real the situation felt. I thought about saying something simple, asking for the time, pretending this was normal, but the idea of her turning toward me made my stomach twist. Without warning, she shifted slightly, not stepping, just adjusting her position in the air, and the movement was smooth in a way that made my skin prickle. My breath caught, and I took an involuntary step back, my heel scraping softly against the concrete, and the sound echoed more than it should have. She turned her head then, slowly, just enough that I could see part of her face, pale in the streetlight. Her expression neutral, almost blank. Her eyes met mine, and there was nothing in them that suggested surprise or recognition, just a steady, waiting look that made me feel like I was late. I couldn't look away, even though every instinct told me to move, to leave, to run, and my thoughts scattered, refusing to form anything useful. I realized then that her feet hadn't moved at all, that she had turned without shifting position, and the gap beneath her remained unchanged. The streetlight flickered again, briefly dimming, and for a split second I was terrified she would disappear when it came back on. She didn't. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as if listening for something behind me, and that small gesture filled me with a cold, creeping dread. I became acutely aware of the space at my back, the empty street stretching away, and resisted the urge to look over my shoulder. My legs felt weak, and I forced myself to breathe slowly, counting the seconds between inhales, trying to regain some control. Neither of us spoke, and the silence between us felt intentional, like part of an unspoken rule. After what felt like far too long, she turned her gaze back toward the street ahead, resuming her original position, still waiting, still hovering. The dismissal stung in a strange way, like I had failed a test I didn't know I was taking. I took another step backward, then another, keeping my eyes on her feet, half expecting them to finally touch down. They never did. When I felt the edge of the curb behind me, I turned and walked away, not running, not looking back again, my body tense and alert to every sound. The rest of the walk home blurred together, my thoughts looping around the image of that gap, that impossible stillness, and I kept checking corners, expecting to see her again. Inside my apartment, I locked the door and leaned against it, my heart racing, listening to the building settle around me. I told myself I had imagined it, that exhaustion and darkness had filled in details that weren't there, and the explanation felt thin but necessary. Later, lying in bed, I replayed the moment over and over, trying to remember if she had cast a shadow, if the light had bent strangely, if there was any sign I could have missed. When I finally slept, I dreamed of standing at that corner, waiting for something unnamed, my feet just barely not touching the ground, and when I woke up, the feeling of hovering stayed with me longer than it should have. I noticed the streetlight before it noticed me, standing at the far end of the block like a tired sentinel, its glow softer than the others, and I remember thinking it looked dimmer than usual even before I started walking toward it, which already made me uneasy in a way I couldn't fully explain. It was just after midnight, maybe closer to 1, and the air still carried the damp smell of rain even though the sky had cleared, and the pavement reflected the lights in dull, uneven patches that made the street feel longer than it really was. I had my hands in my jacket pockets, shoulders slightly hunched, moving at a steady pace I'd used 100 times before, and I told myself this was just another quiet walk, nothing different, nothing worth paying attention to, even though my thoughts kept drifting back to that one streetlight. The closer I got, the more I became aware of the silence, not complete, but thin, stretched tight, like the city was trying not to make noise, and I found myself listening for footsteps that never came. The streetlight flickered once as I approached, not enough to go out, just a brief dip in brightness, and my stomach tightened instinctively, as if my body had recognized something before my mind did. I slowed down without realizing it, my steps shorter, more careful, and I glanced around to see if anyone else was nearby, hoping to share the moment with another presence. But the street was empty in every direction. When I was only a few feet away, I noticed how the light pooled on the sidewalk beneath it, a soft circle that didn't quite reach the edges, leaving the corners darker than they should have been. I stepped into that circle, and the moment I did, the streetlight dimmed. It wasn't dramatic, not a sudden blackout or a flicker, just a gentle lowering of intensity, like someone had turned a dial down slightly, but it happened exactly as I passed beneath it, and that timing made my breath catch. I stopped walking, standing directly under the light, and waited, expecting it to brighten again now that I was still, but it didn't, and the dimness settled around me like a quiet acknowledgement. I tilted my head back, squinting up at the bulb, half expecting to see it flicker or buzz, but it remained steady, humming faintly, as if nothing unusual had happened. I took a step forward, out of the circle of light, and behind me, it brightened again. The contrast was subtle but unmistakable, and I turned slowly, watching the light return to its earlier glow as soon as I moved away, and a chill ran through me despite the mild night air. I told myself it had to be a coincidence, maybe a loose wire reacting to vibration, maybe my movement had lined up perfectly with some electrical fluctuation, and the explanations felt logical enough to keep me from panicking. Still, I stepped back beneath the streetlight again, deliberately this time, my heart beating a little faster as I tested it, and once more, the light dimmed the instant I entered its reach. I stood there longer this time, staring at my own shadow, noticing how it softened and blurred as the light weakened, and I felt strangely exposed, like the light was responding to me personally. I waved a hand above my head, feeling foolish, and the light didn't change, staying dim and patient, and the sense of being acknowledged deepened. My thoughts began to race quietly, not loud panic. Just a steady stream of questions with nowhere to land, and I became aware of how alone I was again. I stepped out from under the streetlight a second time, and again, it brightened, the pattern too consistent now to ignore, and I laughed softly to myself, the sound nervous and thin in the empty street. I told myself to keep walking, to not make a thing out of it, but my feet hesitated, my body reluctant to leave the spot where something, anything, had reacted to my presence. I glanced up and down the street, half expecting another light to dim, another sign that this wasn't isolated, but the rest of the block looked unchanged, indifferent. Eventually, I moved on, my pace quicker now, and I felt the dimness lift behind me as I left the streetlight circle, the normal glow returning like nothing had happened. But the relief didn't come. As I continued down the street, I kept looking back over my shoulder, checking that light, watching it shrink in the distance, and each time I looked, it seemed just a little dimmer than the others around it. A few blocks later, I came to another streetlight, this one brighter, newer, its light sharper against the wet pavement, and I told myself this was a chance to prove the first one was a fluke. I walked toward it with forced confidence, my steps loud in the quiet, my eyes fixed on the pool of light ahead, and I felt a strange mix of dread and anticipation. As I passed beneath the second streetlight, nothing happened. The light stayed bright and steady, my shadow crisp and unchanged, and I felt a rush of relief so strong it almost made me dizzy. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and kept walking, telling myself that was the end of it, that my nerves had gotten the better of me, and the night was playing tricks. But as I walked away, I noticed something that made my shoulders tense again. Behind me, the second streetlight dimmed slightly. I stopped and turned around, my heart pounding, and watched it from a distance, and as soon as I faced it, the light returned to full brightness. The realization crept in slowly, heavy and unwelcome, that it wasn't just when I passed beneath them, but when I was near enough, when my presence was close enough to matter. I stood there, caught between two streetlights now, one behind me, one ahead, and felt like I was standing in the middle of something I didn't understand. I took a cautious step backward, watching the light behind me dim as I approached it, and a step forward, watching it brighten again, the response smooth and immediate. The street felt smaller suddenly, the distance between lights shorter, and I felt like the ground beneath me was less stable than it had been moments before. I considered going back the way I came, retracing my steps quickly, but the idea of passing beneath that first streetlight again made my stomach knot. So I kept moving forward, choosing the unknown ahead over the known strangeness behind, and every streetlight I passed after that stayed bright, almost too bright, as if overcompensating. Still, I felt watched, not by eyes, but by something more passive, more infrastructural, like the street itself was aware of me in a way it shouldn't have been. When I finally reached my building, I hurried inside, the warmth of the lobby lights feeling artificial and thin, and I didn't relax until the door locked behind me. Inside my apartment, I turned off most of the lights and sat on the edge of my bed, listening to the distant sounds of the city returning, cars passing, a siren far away, normal noises reclaiming the night. I told myself it was electrical coincidence, old wiring, my imagination stretched thin by fatigue and solitude, and the explanation stacked up neatly in my mind. But later, when I looked out my window, I noticed the streetlight across the road, the one directly below my apartment, glowing steadily in the dark. As I stood there watching it, the light dimmed just slightly, and I realized it had done so the moment I stepped closer to the glass, and I didn't move away right away. I heard the door close just as I was drifting toward sleep, that thin moment when thoughts lose their edges and sounds feel farther away than they should, and I remember opening my eyes slowly, not startled exactly, but alert in the quiet way you get when something doesn't belong. It wasn't loud, not a slam, more like a careful closing, wood meeting frame with intention, and it came from somewhere inside the building, not my apartment, not clearly above or below me, just within. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds afterward, waiting for footsteps or voices or the familiar shuffle of a neighbor moving around, but nothing followed, and the silence that settled felt deliberate. The building was old, the kind that always made noise, pipes knocking, floors creaking, doors opening and closing at all hours, and normally those sounds blended together into something comforting, something alive, but this one stood apart. I checked the time on my phone, 1:18 a.m., and the blue glow felt too bright in the dark room, so I turned it face down and listened again, suddenly aware of how shallow my breathing was. I told myself it was nothing, that someone had come home late or stepped out onto the stairwell for air, and the explanation fit well enough that I almost believed it. Almost. A few minutes passed, then another sound, softer this time, like movement without footsteps, something shifting weight just out of reach of hearing clearly, and my skin prickled as I strained to locate it. The walls in my apartment felt thinner than usual, closer, and I became aware of how the building held sound, how it carried vibrations in unpredictable ways, making direction unreliable. I sat up slowly, careful not to move too quickly, as if sudden motion might draw attention, and listened with my head tilted slightly toward the hallway wall. There it was again, faint but unmistakable, the subtle click of a latch settling into place, another door closing somewhere deep inside the structure. Not on my floor, I realized, or at least not close, but not far either, and that ambiguity made my stomach tighten. I slipped out of bed and padded quietly to my apartment door, pressing my ear against the cool wood, listening for movement in the hallway, but everything outside was still. No footsteps, no elevator hum, no voices echoing from the stairwell, just the building holding its breath. I stood there longer than I meant to, my hand resting on the doorknob without turning it, imagining what I would see if I opened the door, and none of the images felt reassuring. Another sound drifted through the wall, this one different, a dull thud followed by a faint scrape, like something being nudged into place rather than moved freely. I pulled my hand back from the doorknob, suddenly unsure whether I wanted to know more or less, and stepped away, the room feeling larger and emptier behind me. I sat on the edge of the bed, knees pulled close, listening intently, my thoughts circling the same questions without answers: who, where, why now? The building creaked softly, a low settling sound that ran through the walls, and for a moment I wondered if the structure itself was shifting, adjusting around something inside it. I tried to recall the layout of the apartments, the way the stairwell twisted between floors, the storage rooms tucked into corners I'd never seen, and the mental map felt suddenly incomplete. Another door closed. This one was closer. Not directly outside my apartment, but close enough that I felt it in my chest more than I heard it, a gentle pressure change that made me inhale sharply. I stood again, moving to the center of the room. Unsure where to position myself, as if there were a safer place to stand, and the floor felt cool beneath my feet. I whispered to myself without realizing it, a habit from childhood, and the sound of my own voice startled me with how out of place it felt. The silence afterward stretched, long and thin, and I counted my breaths to stay grounded, listening for anything that might explain what I was hearing. When the next sound came, it wasn't a door. It was the faintest suggestion of movement, like someone shifting their weight slowly, carefully, trying not to be heard, and the realization made my pulse jump. I pressed my back against the wall, suddenly aware of how many walls surrounded me, how many shared spaces existed just beyond them, unseen and mostly ignored. My mind offered explanations again: neighbors pacing, insomnia, someone reorganizing late at night, and each one felt less convincing than the last. I thought about calling out, asking if everything was okay, but the idea of my voice traveling into that quiet, unanswered, made my throat tighten. Instead, I waited. Minutes passed, maybe more, time losing its shape as I stood there, alert and uncomfortable, until I almost convinced myself the sounds had stopped for good. Then I heard it again, unmistakable now, the soft but final sound of a door closing on my floor. I turned slowly toward my apartment door, my heart pounding, listening for footsteps moving away, for the elevator, for anything that suggested someone leaving. There was nothing. No movement, no retreat, just the quiet hum of the building settling back into stillness. I stared at the door, half expecting the handle to turn, the lock to shift, and my hand hovered near my phone, unsure whether calling someone would make things better or worse. After a long while, I sank back onto the bed, exhaustion creeping in despite the tension, my body heavy and alert at the same time. I stayed awake until the first hints of dawn lightened the window. The night slowly releasing its grip, and the building returned to its usual noises: pipes knocking, distant footsteps, familiar and explainable. Later that morning, I stepped into the hallway, scanning the doors around mine for signs of movement, anything out of place, but everything looked normal, quiet, unchanged. Still, as I left the building, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere inside, a door had been closed that hadn't been opened in a very long time. I was already uneasy before it happened, the kind of unease that settles in quietly and makes ordinary things feel slightly misaligned, and I remember thinking I should have stayed home that night instead of stepping out again, but restlessness has a way of pushing you forward even when your instincts are pulling you back. It was close to 1 in the morning, the air cool but not cold, the street still damp from an earlier drizzle that left the pavement smelling faintly metallic, and I walked with my hands in my pockets, shoulders tight, listening to the soft echo of my footsteps. The neighborhood was familiar, painfully so, every storefront shuttered, every parked car exactly where I expected it to be, and that familiarity made the emptiness feel intentional, like a stage set after everyone else had gone home. I noticed her ahead of me near the long brick wall that runs beside the old buildings, walking in the same direction, her pace slow and even, and at first I felt a small, irrational relief at not being completely alone. She was maybe 20 feet ahead, far enough that I couldn't make out her face, but close enough that her presence felt real, grounding, and I adjusted my pace unconsciously to match hers. Her footsteps made almost no sound, which I only noticed after a while, when the rhythm of mine had nothing to answer back to, and I told myself the pavement was just softer there, that I was imagining things again. The streetlight above us hummed quietly, casting our shadows forward. Mine long and stretched, hers thinner, less defined, and I tried not to stare too closely at the way it seemed to blur at the edges. We walked like that for a while, neither of us turning, neither of us acknowledging the other, and the silence between us felt fragile, like something that could shatter if I spoke. I considered clearing my throat, or slowing down to let her get farther ahead, but every small decision felt weighted, and I kept walking instead. The buildings beside us were dark, windows reflecting nothing, and I had the strange thought that the street felt narrower than it had earlier, like it was gently guiding us forward. I don't know why I was certain she knew I was there, but the feeling grew stronger with every step, a quiet awareness that didn't need proof. My mind wandered to earlier moments from the past few nights, the dimming lights, the warm sidewalk, the sounds inside the building, and I felt a tight knot form low in my chest. She slowed slightly, just enough that the distance between us closed without me changing my pace, and my pulse quickened at the small shift. We approached an intersection where the street opens up briefly, and the air there felt cooler, heavier, as if it pooled differently at the corners. I remember thinking I should cross the street, take another route, do something to break the pattern, but my feet kept moving straight ahead. She stopped. Not abruptly, just a smooth, unhurried stop, her shoulders relaxed, her posture unchanged, and I nearly walked into her before I caught myself. I stopped a few steps behind her, my heart thudding hard enough that I was sure she could hear it, and I waited for her to turn around. She didn't. For a moment, neither of us moved, and the quiet pressed in so tightly that it felt like sound itself had been removed from the air. Then she spoke. She said my name clearly, softly, with the casual certainty of someone who had said it many times before, and she did it without turning around. The sound of my name in her voice sent a sharp, cold shock through me, and my body reacted before my mind could, my breath catching, my hands clenching in my pockets. I hadn't told her my name. I hadn't spoken at all. I stood there frozen, staring at the back of her head, my thoughts scattering, reaching for explanations that refused to line up. Maybe she was talking to someone else, I told myself, someone behind me, but the street was empty, and I could feel the space at my back, wide and unoccupied. She didn't move after saying it, didn't repeat it, didn't add anything else, and the silence that followed felt expectant. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry, and considered responding, even just a confused, yes, but the idea of speaking felt wrong, like answering would mean agreeing to something I didn't understand. I waited for her to turn, to reveal a face I could recognize or at least interpret, but she stayed exactly as she was, facing the intersection, still and patient. My name echoed in my head, stripped of familiarity, sounding different now that it had come from a stranger's mouth. I took a slow step backward, careful and quiet, testing whether the moment would break if I moved. She didn't react. I took another step back, my heart pounding, the night suddenly feeling too open, too exposed, and still she remained motionless. I thought about running, the impulse sharp and immediate, but my legs felt heavy, reluctant, as if leaving would require more effort than I had. I whispered her name instead, or at least a question, I'm not sure which, and the sound came out barely audible, swallowed by the space between us. She didn't answer. After a few seconds that felt much longer, she began to walk again, resuming her slow, steady pace, never once looking back. I stood there, watching her move away, the distance between us growing, and the urge to follow warred with the need to escape. I chose neither at first. Standing in place until she reached the far side of the intersection, her figure dimming under the next streetlight. When she disappeared around the corner, the street felt suddenly unfamiliar, like I had stepped into it for the first time. I turned and walked the other way, my pace quickening despite myself, my thoughts tangled and unsteady, replaying the sound of my name over and over. All the way home, I listened for footsteps behind me, for another voice, for anything that might confirm I hadn't imagined it. Inside my apartment, I locked the door and leaned against it, my chest tight, the silence inside louder than the street had been. I told myself it was coincidence, that she had guessed, that my mind had filled in the rest, and the explanations felt fragile but necessary. Lying in bed later, staring into the dark, I tried to remember how she had said my name, not the sound of it, but the tone, calm and familiar, as if she had always known it. Just before sleep finally pulled me under, I realized something that kept me awake again. She hadn't said it like a question. She had said it like a reminder. I noticed the windows because I had stopped moving, and when you stop late at night, everything else seems to reveal itself, and I remember standing there under a streetlight that hummed softly, checking my phone for the time even though I already felt how late it was in my bones. It was a little after 1:30 a.m., the kind of hour when the city feels emptied out but not asleep, and the street was lined with old apartment buildings, their ground floor windows dark, glass dulled by years of dust and weather. I had paused to retie my shoe, bending down briefly, and when I straightened back up, I caught my reflection in one of the windows across the sidewalk, stretched slightly by the angle, my posture stiff and tired. I stayed still for a moment longer than necessary, mostly because I felt watched in that familiar, irrational way that comes when you're alone at night, and I wanted to prove to myself that nothing was happening. That was when my reflection shifted. Not much, just a slight movement in the shoulder, like I had adjusted my stance, and my first thought was that I'd moved without realizing it. So I froze. I planted my feet, let my arms hang loosely at my sides, and held my breath, staring directly at the dark glass. The reflection didn't stop. It took a small step forward, subtle enough that I questioned my own eyes, and a chill crept up my back as I realized the timing was wrong. I was perfectly still. My muscles ached from holding position, my breathing shallow and controlled, and yet the shape in the glass continued to move, slowly, deliberately, like it was testing how much freedom it had. I glanced down at my feet to confirm I hadn't shifted, then back at the window, and the reflection seemed closer now, its outline sharper, more confident. My heart began to beat louder in my ears, each thud breaking the silence in a way that felt intrusive, and I wondered if exhaustion had finally caught up with me. I told myself reflections can lag, that glass distorts, that my eyes were adjusting to low light, and the explanations lined up neatly in my head without convincing me. I raised one hand slowly, carefully, watching my arm in the glass. It didn't raise its hand. It tilted its head instead. The movement was small but unmistakable, a curious angle that I hadn't mirrored, and a cold, hollow feeling opened in my chest as I realized this wasn't a delay or distortion. This was different. I lowered my hand again, my fingers tingling, and the reflection stepped closer to the glass, close enough now that I could make out vague facial features, blurred but intent. I felt suddenly exposed, like the glass wasn't a barrier at all, just a thin suggestion of separation, and the idea made my skin crawl. I took a step back instinctively, breaking the spell, and the reflection didn't follow. Instead, it stayed where it was, standing closer to the window than I now was, occupying a space I had just vacated. The street around me felt wrong after that, stretched and quiet, the other windows lining the building suddenly feeling less passive, less empty. I turned my head slowly, checking the next window, then the next, and my stomach tightened as I saw movement ripple across their surfaces too. In each one, my reflection was just a little off. One leaned forward slightly, another lagged half a second behind, another shifted its weight in a way I hadn't, and the combined effect made my thoughts feel slippery and unreliable. I stood there, surrounded by versions of myself that didn't quite agree with me, and the silence pressed in so tightly that it felt like sound had been removed on purpose. I tried to move again, taking a few careful steps forward, and the reflections responded unevenly, some matching me, some moving too late, some too early. One didn't move at all. That one stayed where it was, standing in a window I had already passed, watching from behind with a posture that felt patient. I didn't turn around to check if it was still there. I was afraid of what I'd see if I confirmed it. My pace quickened, my footsteps suddenly loud and clumsy, and I kept my eyes forward, forcing myself not to look at the glass anymore. But even without looking, I could feel it, a subtle awareness of motion at the edges of my vision, like something pacing me just out of sight. When I reached a stretch of the street where the windows were boarded up, I felt a thin wash of relief, the absence of reflection feeling like a break in the tension. I stopped again there, breathing hard, and turned slowly in a full circle, checking the empty street, the parked cars, the dark doorways. Everything looked normal. Too normal. I laughed quietly to myself, the sound brittle, and told myself I was done walking for the night. That I'd pushed my nerves far enough. On the way home, I avoided looking at any glass at all, not shop windows, not car mirrors, not the dark screen of my phone when it caught reflections at the wrong angle. Inside my apartment building, the hallway lights felt harsh and artificial, and the walls reflected nothing at all, just matte paint and shadow. I locked my door behind me and leaned against it, my heart still racing, listening to the familiar sounds of the building settling around me. Later, when I stood in my bathroom brushing my teeth, I kept my eyes fixed on the sink, avoiding the mirror above it, afraid of what might happen if I checked. I finally looked just before bed, telling myself I had to, that avoiding it would only make things worse. The reflection stared back normally, tired and pale, moving exactly when I did, and I felt a rush of relief that left me weak. But as I turned off the light and stepped away, I caught a glimpse of the mirror in the dark. My reflection was still standing there, just for a second longer than it should have been, before the room went completely still. I noticed the smell before anything else, that sharp, clean scent of rain that usually comes with cool air and wet pavement, and it caught me off guard because when I looked down, the street beneath my feet was completely dry. It was late again, sometime after 1 in the morning, when the city feels hollowed out, and I had stepped outside because the apartment felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that presses inward and makes your thoughts louder than they should be. The night air was still, not even a breeze, and the sky above was clear, no clouds, no hint of weather moving in, yet the smell lingered unmistakably, fresh and metallic, like rain that had just ended. I paused near the curb, breathing in slowly, testing it, expecting the scent to fade once I paid attention to it, but it stayed, steady and present, as if the rain were just out of sight. I looked up and down the street, the asphalt pale under the streetlights, no dark patches, no shine, no reflections, and the sidewalks were dusty at the edges, undisturbed for hours. For a moment, I wondered if I was remembering rain instead of smelling it, my mind filling in gaps the way it sometimes does late at night, but the scent felt too clear for that, too specific. I started walking, telling myself it would disappear once I moved, that it was probably drifting in from somewhere else, but with each step, it followed me, consistent and calm. The smell brought with it a strange sense of familiarity, something tied to childhood evenings and open windows, and that familiarity made the emptiness of the street feel heavier by contrast. I passed under a streetlight and instinctively glanced down again, half expecting the pavement to be wet there, but it remained dull and dry, tiny pebbles visible where water should have darkened them. The scent grew stronger near the intersection, and I slowed, my thoughts tightening, wondering how rain could have such presence without leaving any trace behind. I bent slightly and brushed my fingers against the sidewalk, feeling dust cling to my skin, confirming what my eyes already knew, and the contradiction made my stomach tighten. I wiped my hand on my jacket and straightened up, suddenly aware of how quiet everything was again, the kind of quiet that makes small details feel amplified. The smell reminded me of the moment just before rain starts, when the air changes first, and that idea lodged uncomfortably in my mind, because nothing else was changing. No wind picked up. No distant thunder. No cars hissed past on wet roads. I stood still and closed my eyes briefly, focusing on the scent alone, and it felt close, almost intimate, like it was coming from the space around my face rather than the street itself. When I opened my eyes again, the buildings looked the same, solid and unbothered, their windows dark. Their surfaces dry and indifferent. I started walking faster, wanting to outpace the sensation, but the smell stayed with me, neither fading nor intensifying, just present enough to be noticed. I passed a closed cafe, its awning stiff and dusty, no dampness on the fabric, no puddles beneath it, and the smell felt especially wrong there, out of context. My thoughts began looping again, searching for explanations, maybe a street cleaner earlier, maybe water evaporating from somewhere hidden, and none of the ideas felt satisfying. The deeper I went into the neighborhood, the more the smell seemed to settle in, like it had found the right place to exist, and I felt an odd pressure behind my eyes. I became aware of my breathing, how shallow it had become, and forced myself to take slower breaths, though each inhale brought the scent more clearly. It didn't smell like rain that had fallen hours ago. It smelled recent. Alive. I stopped near a row of parked cars and ran my hand along the hood of one, expecting cool dampness, but the metal was dry and faintly warm, holding the day's leftover heat. The smell felt disconnected now, unanchored, and the thought made me uneasy in a way I couldn't articulate. I imagined rain falling somewhere nearby but invisible, soaking into things I couldn't see, and the image made my chest feel tight. The streetlights hummed softly above me, steady and bright, and I wondered briefly if the smell was tied to the light, the warmth, something reacting quietly without leaving evidence. I shook my head at the thought and kept walking, telling myself not to spiral, that late nights play tricks on perception. Still, the scent followed. At one point, I thought it had faded, and a small wave of relief passed through me, but a few steps later it returned, just as clear as before, like it had been waiting. I noticed then that the street felt different, not visually, but in how it held space, like the air itself had weight. And moving through it required more effort. I slowed again, my footsteps echoing softly, and listened for the sound of rain I expected to hear, the faint tapping, the distant hiss, anything. There was nothing. Only my breathing and the hum of electricity somewhere overhead. I felt suddenly out of place, like I was walking through a version of the street meant for a different moment, one where rain had already come. The idea stuck with me, unsettling in its simplicity. I turned around and retraced my steps, watching the ground closely, waiting for it to change, to reveal dampness or shine, but it stayed stubbornly dry. The smell didn't weaken. If anything, it felt more settled now, less like it was drifting and more like it belonged. By the time I reached my building, my nerves were worn thin, and I hurried inside, the familiar smell of dust and old paint replacing the rain. The lobby floor was dry, the walls dull, and for a moment, I felt foolish, embarrassed by how tense I had become over something so intangible. In my apartment, I closed the door and leaned against it, breathing slowly, waiting to see if the scent would follow me inside. It didn't. The air smelled normal, stale in the way apartments do at night, and I let out a quiet breath of relief. Later, as I lay in bed, the window cracked open slightly. I told myself the smell must have come from somewhere distant, carried on air currents I hadn't noticed. Just as I was drifting toward sleep, the scent returned faintly, close to my face, like rain had begun falling somewhere very nearby. When I sat up and listened, the street below was still completely dry. I wasn't planning to go out that night, not after everything that had been happening, but the apartment felt wrong again, too quiet in a way that made my thoughts echo, and when I checked the time it was just past 1:40 a.m., late enough that the city outside would be empty but not late enough to feel impossible. The air outside hit me immediately, heavier than it should have been, warm despite the hour, and I stood on the steps for a moment letting my eyes adjust, listening for something familiar to ground myself. The street looked normal at first glance, the same row of buildings, the same parked cars, the same uneven sidewalk, and I told myself that was enough, that normal appearances meant normal explanations. I walked slowly, hands deep in my jacket pockets, my shoulders tight, aware of every sound my shoes made against the pavement, the echo lingering just a little longer than usual. It was quiet again, the kind of quiet that feels intentional rather than accidental, and I noticed how the streetlights seemed to hum more than glow, their light thick and dull, not spreading as far as it normally did. I saw her near the end of the block. She stood just beyond the reach of one streetlight, in the soft edge where light fades into shadow, and my first reaction was irritation more than fear, a brief, sharp annoyance at seeing someone else out there when I wanted the street to myself. She wasn't facing me. She stood sideways to the road, her posture relaxed, almost casual, like someone pausing mid-thought, and I slowed my pace without fully deciding to. As I got closer, that familiar unease returned, the quiet certainty that she was aware of me without looking, and the air around us felt different, like it resisted movement just slightly. I stopped a few steps away from her, far enough to feel safe, close enough to feel involved, and waited for her to acknowledge me. She didn't. The streetlight above buzzed softly, and the sound seemed muted, as if wrapped in cloth, and I became aware of how thick the air felt in my lungs when I breathed. It wasn't hard to breathe exactly, just slower, like each inhale had to push through something unseen. She raised her arm then, slowly, deliberately, and pointed down the road ahead of us. The motion was calm, unhurried. As if she had all the time in the world, and the moment her finger settled in that direction, the air changed. It felt denser instantly, pressing gently against my skin, against my face, and my ears popped slightly like they do with altitude changes. I swallowed and felt the movement echo in my throat, heavier than it should have been, and my heart began to beat faster in response. I followed her gesture reluctantly, my eyes tracing the line of her finger down the road, and nothing looked different at first. The street stretched on into darkness, a slight curve halfway down, the lights beyond dimmer and more uneven, but otherwise unchanged. Still, the pressure in the air remained, steady and present, and I became acutely aware of my own body occupying space, of how much room I took up just by standing there. I glanced at her face, trying to read her expression, but her features were softened by shadow, indistinct, and she still hadn't turned toward me. I wanted to ask what she was pointing at, to break the silence, but the idea of speaking felt intrusive, like sound itself might not travel properly here. My thoughts began to slow, each one forming carefully, heavily, and the sense of being observed returned, not from her, but from the direction she indicated. I shifted my weight from one foot to the other, and the movement felt exaggerated, delayed, like my body had to ask permission to move. The air down the road looked thicker too, not visibly foggy, just subtly compressed, the light struggling to pass through it cleanly. I felt a pull then, not physical, but suggestive, a quiet invitation or expectation that I should walk that way, that standing still wasn't the correct choice. My chest tightened at the thought, and I took a small step backward instead, testing whether the pressure would ease. It didn't. She lowered her arms slowly, the pointing finished, and the air remained thick, unchanged by the end of the gesture. For the first time. She turned her head slightly toward me, not enough to face me fully, just enough that I could see the outline of her jaw. Her voice came softly when she spoke, barely louder than the hum of the streetlight, and she said nothing specific, just a quiet sound that felt like acknowledgement rather than language. My name wasn't spoken this time, but the familiarity was there again, heavy and unsettling. I shook my head without meaning to, a small refusal, and the movement felt effortful, like pushing against water. I took another step back, then another, my pulse loud in my ears, and finally the pressure began to ease just slightly, enough that I noticed the difference. She didn't follow. She stayed where she was, her attention still angled down the road, patient and unmoving, as if she knew time would handle the rest. I turned away fully then and walked back the way I had come, my pace uneven, my breathing shallow, and with each step the air gradually thinned, returning to something closer to normal. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if she was watching me leave or still pointing, waiting for a moment I had refused. When I reached my building, the familiar weight of the door in my hand felt reassuring, solid in a way the street no longer did. Inside, the air felt lighter, easier to breathe, and I stood there for a long moment letting my lungs fill normally again. Later, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about the way the air had changed so quickly, so precisely, as if the street itself had responded to her gesture. I wondered what would have happened if I had walked down that road, past the curve, into the thicker dark where the light struggled. Outside, everything stayed quiet. But even hours later, with the window closed and the room still, the air around me felt just a little heavier than it should have been. I didn't mean to take the alley that night, but my usual route felt exposed in a way I couldn't explain. And when I reached the corner and saw the narrow cut between the buildings, I turned into it without thinking, telling myself it would be quicker and quieter. It was well past 1 in the morning, the kind of late where even the city's background noise feels tired, and the alley smelled faintly of dust and old moisture, not unpleasant, just neglected. The light didn't reach very far inside, just a pale spill from the street behind me and another weak glow somewhere ahead, leaving the middle stretched thin with shadow, and my footsteps sounded too loud against the concrete walls. At first, it felt no different than it ever had, the same dumpsters pushed against brick, the same uneven pavement, the same graffiti half peeled and faded, and I relaxed a fraction as I walked deeper in. The air was still, no breeze at all, and the quiet wrapped around me gently, not threatening yet, just isolating, and I focused on the sound of my breathing to stay grounded. I took a few more steps before I noticed how close the walls felt. Not visibly closer, not in any way I could point to, but close enough that my shoulders tightened instinctively, as if my body sensed a change before my eyes did. I slowed down and glanced to my left, then my right, the brick surfaces rough and unchanged, their textures familiar, and I told myself it was just the lack of light playing with my depth perception. Still, I felt the urge to walk more carefully, my steps shorter, my arms closer to my sides, and the thought crept in that I didn't remember the alley feeling this tight before. I stopped walking altogether and stood still, listening, waiting to see if the sensation would fade once I paused. It didn't. The air felt heavier here too, pressing gently against my chest, and when I inhaled, it felt like drawing breath through something dense, not difficult, just deliberate. I shifted my weight slightly, testing the space around me, and the movement felt constrained, like there was less room to move than there should have been. I laughed under my breath, the sound flat and brief, trying to break the tension, and it echoed oddly, bouncing back too quickly from the walls. That was when I noticed the distance between them. The alley looked narrower. Not by much, not dramatically, but enough that the dumpsters seemed closer together, enough that the line of sight ahead felt tighter, compressed. I blinked hard and looked again, focusing on details, the stains on the brick, the chipped paint on the metal lids, and everything appeared normal individually. Together, it felt wrong. I took a cautious step forward, my foot landing softly, and the walls seemed to follow the movement, the space adjusting just slightly, as if accommodating me. My heart began to beat faster, not panicked yet, just alert, and I stopped again, holding my breath. The alley held still with me. I told myself it was perspective, that walking deeper into a narrow space always makes it feel tighter, and the explanation was reasonable enough to keep me from turning around immediately. I took another step. The sensation returned instantly, the subtle pressure on my shoulders, the awareness of the walls at my sides, and I realized I was holding my arms unnaturally close to my body. I glanced back toward the entrance of the alley, half expecting it to look farther away than it should have, and it did, the opening seeming smaller, the light dimmer. That made my stomach tighten. I turned forward again and continued walking, my pace measured, my thoughts looping, telling myself not to jump to conclusions, not to let imagination fill in gaps. With each step, the alley seemed to lose a fraction of its width, not enough to measure, not enough to point to, but enough to feel. The walls weren't moving in a way I could see. They were just closer. I brushed my fingertips lightly against the brick on my right, needing confirmation of something solid, and the rough surface scraped gently against my skin. I didn't remember being that close. I pulled my hand back quickly and wiped it on my jacket, my breathing shallow now, the quiet pressing in from all sides. The light ahead looked farther away than before, the glow weaker, as if the alley was stretching lengthwise even as it narrowed. I stopped again, considering turning around fully, abandoning the shortcut, and the idea felt urgent, almost necessary. But when I looked back once more, the entrance seemed tighter now too, the walls closer there as well, and the thought of squeezing back through made my chest feel tight. I stood there, caught between directions, aware of my own body occupying space that felt increasingly limited. I became acutely aware of my shoulders, my elbows, the width of my torso, things I never think about when moving normally. The air felt warmer here, stale, and my breath sounded loud and intrusive, as if the alley didn't want noise. I took another step forward. This time, my shoulder brushed the wall without me leaning. The contact was light but undeniable, brick against fabric, and my pulse spiked in response. I froze, pressing myself flat instinctively, and waited for something to happen. Nothing did. The walls stayed where they were, close and patient, and the stillness felt intentional, like it was giving me time to notice. I swallowed hard and took a shallow breath, my thoughts slowing, focusing only on the space immediately around me. I tried to step backward. The movement was awkward, restricted, my heel scraping the ground as if the alley resisted the motion. I stopped again. My heart pounding, and realized how narrow it had become. I could still move. But not comfortably. I turned my body slightly sideways and shuffled forward, the fabric of my jacket brushing both walls now, the sound soft and constant. The sensation was claustrophobic in a way that bypassed logic, settling directly into my chest and throat. I told myself not to panic, that panic would only make it worse, and the thought echoed uselessly in my head. The light ahead flickered faintly, and I focused on it, treating it like a goal, something to move toward, something fixed. Each step forward felt heavier, like moving through resistance, and the alley seemed to respond by tightening just a little more. My shoulders were pressed now, my arms pinned close, and I could feel the texture of both walls through my clothes. I wondered, distantly, how this could be happening without sound, without movement, without any visible change. The idea that it might have always been like this, and I was only now noticing, crept in and made my stomach churn. I stopped again, chest tight, breath shallow, and closed my eyes for a brief second, hoping when I opened them the space would feel normal again. It didn't. If anything, it felt closer. I could feel my heartbeat in my neck, my pulse loud in my ears, and the alley felt too aware of me, too responsive to ignore. I whispered to myself, a small, grounding sound, and the word came back to me flattened, absorbed by the narrow space. The light ahead was very close now, just a few more steps, and I forced myself forward, my movements careful and slow. When I finally reached the end of the alley and stepped out onto the open street, the space widened instantly, the pressure lifting so suddenly that I staggered slightly. I turned around, breathing hard, and stared back into the alley. It looked normal. Narrow, yes, but no narrower than it had ever been, the walls straight and unmoving, the dumpsters where they always were. I stood there for a long moment, my heart slowly settling, the open street around me feeling almost unreal in its openness. I told myself it was stress, exhaustion, the accumulation of too many strange nights and not enough sleep. I walked away without looking back again. Later, safe inside my apartment, I replayed the walk in my mind, trying to pinpoint the moment things had changed. I couldn't find it. The next day, in full daylight, I passed the alley again from the street, and it looked exactly as it always had. Still, as I walked by, I felt the urge to keep my shoulders tight, just in case. I started counting my steps almost without thinking, one foot after the other, the rhythm a small anchor in the quiet night, and I remember hoping that focusing on something so ordinary would keep the unease at bay. It was past 1 in the morning, the streets damp from an earlier drizzle, the smell of wet asphalt sharp and metallic, and the air carried that peculiar weight you notice only when the city sleeps. My hands were in my pockets, my coat pulled tight, and I felt the soft crunch of gravel under my shoes like a reminder that I was still here, still moving. 1, 2, 3. I repeated the count in my head, softly, like a mantra. 4, 5, 6. The numbers were meant to make me feel in control, a tiny measure of certainty against the emptiness around me. The streetlights stretched far apart, pools of yellow light separated by shadows so deep that my eyes played tricks, making familiar corners look strange and long. Each step I took echoed slightly, mingling with the soft hum of distant traffic, yet the echoes felt delayed, stretched, almost reluctant to follow me. 10, 11, 12. My count became a heartbeat, a rhythm intertwined with the quiet of the night. I glanced at my phone briefly, expecting the time to reassure me, but the screen was blank, dead. No signal, or maybe the battery had died. Either way, I felt a flicker of unease, the kind that whispers that something isn't right. I tried to focus on the numbers, the simple sequence of 1, 2, 3, yet the shadows at the edges of the street seemed to shift when I looked directly at them. The alleys yawned slightly wider, the corners darkened more than they should, and I felt my pace slow as if the world itself had thickened around me. 15, 16, 17. I realized I hadn't been counting out loud, but inside my head, the numbers echoed in a loop, constant but unsteady, like a clock losing time. I stopped briefly under a flickering streetlight, staring at the reflection of my own legs in a puddle that wasn't there moments ago, and tried to place myself in time. What hour was it? How long had I been walking? The questions felt heavier than the steps themselves, the answers evaporating before I could grasp them. 20, 21, 22. The count became meaningless, my mind slipping into a soft panic as the rhythm faltered. Shadows seemed closer now, stretching across the pavement toward me, but when I glanced up, nothing moved. The street remained empty. I tried restarting the count, slower this time, 1, 2, 3, hoping it would reset something inside me. The act of counting should make me feel safe, grounded, but instead the numbers tangled, doubled, skipped. Time itself felt porous, like I was walking in a place where minutes and seconds no longer followed the rules. 27, 28, or was it 30? My thoughts swirled in the darkness, the streetlights above flickering as if aware, each step echoing too long, too soft, or not at all. I could feel the weight of the night pressing in from every side, the silence turning thick and almost tactile. I tried to take note of landmarks, familiar buildings, corners, cracks in the pavement, but each one seemed to drift slightly when I wasn't looking directly at it. My steps continued, but I lost all sense of how far I'd gone. How long I'd been moving. 45, or maybe 60. I couldn't tell. My legs felt tired, though I hadn't walked far. The street seemed endless, stretching beyond memory, and I realized that counting steps was no longer an anchor, it was a tether to something I couldn't understand. I glanced down an alley I passed earlier, expecting the same familiarity, but the shadows were deeper, the walls slightly closer, as though the world itself had shifted while I wasn't watching. I took another step, and the numbers in my head tumbled, falling out of sequence. I stopped completely, breathing shallow, and for a moment, the quiet pressed so heavily against my ears that I couldn't hear my own heartbeat. The night held me in place, stretching time, warping it, making seconds feel like minutes and minutes feel like hours. I tried to start counting again, 1, 2, 3, but my mind refused to cooperate. The steps I had taken, the time I thought I had measured, it all slipped away, leaving only the sense that I was moving endlessly in a street that refused to end. Eventually, I found myself near my apartment building, though I couldn't say how I got there. The street was empty, the air quiet, and yet I felt heavier, somehow, as if the night had left its weight on me. I went inside, locked the door, and sat on the edge of my bed, counting slowly in my head again, trying to convince myself that I was safe, that time had resumed its proper flow. But I couldn't tell if the numbers were real, if the hours were real, or if I had been walking for minutes, hours, or something much stranger. And when I finally closed my eyes, the echo of my own steps continued to tick through my mind, long after the street had gone completely silent. I first noticed her at the far end of the block, standing under a dim streetlight that flickered softly. The kind of light that stretches shadows thin and sharp. I hadn't planned to be out so late, maybe 1:30 in the morning, but something in the apartment had pressed too hard, a stillness that made the walls feel heavier than they were, and I needed the street to breathe. She stood there quietly, almost perfectly still, her back to me. I wasn't close enough to see her face, only the vague outline of her shoulders, the slope of her head. At first, I thought she was waiting for someone, or perhaps lost in thought, but even from that distance, I felt her attention, an awareness of me that made my chest tighten. I slowed my pace instinctively, keeping my hands in my pockets, listening to my own footsteps echo against the quiet asphalt. The street smelled faintly of wet concrete from an earlier drizzle, though the air had dried again. Every detail was ordinary, painfully ordinary, yet it was the ordinary that felt wrong. She didn't move as I got closer, didn't glance over her shoulder, didn't shift her weight. My mind searched for explanations, someone leaning, waiting for a friend, but the stillness wasn't natural. It was deliberate, patient. I walked past her at a distance of maybe 15 feet, my own shadow stretching long and thin under the flickering light. I wanted to look at her directly, to confirm what I was seeing, but something restrained me. The quiet whispered that looking might change it. I glanced back after a few steps. She was gone. I stopped immediately, heart leaping. The street behind me was empty, not even a hint of movement, nothing to indicate she had stepped aside. The light still hummed quietly, the parked cars remained, and the small puddles reflected the glow exactly as they had before. Nothing had changed. My pulse raced as I slowly turned, scanning the block. The street looked identical to the moment before she had been there, same buildings, same darkened windows. Same shadows stretching across the pavement. The corner she had been standing under was empty. I took a tentative step forward, half expecting her to reappear just beyond my line of sight, but there was only the soft echo of my own movements. I called her name quietly, just once, and the sound bounced back to me, swallowed by the empty street. The more I looked, the stranger it felt. There was no sign of her leaving, no footsteps, no disturbed dust, no movement of the street at all. It was as if she had never existed, as if the night had folded itself around her presence and erased it completely. I walked back slowly, trying to convince myself I must have imagined it, that exhaustion or stress had conjured her silhouette from the dim light and the shadows. But the memory was too sharp, too solid, the weight of her stillness, the way she had seemed aware of me without turning, the faint warmth of the street beneath her feet. The air felt heavier as I reached the end of the block, and I found myself looking down every alley, every doorway, half expecting her to step out or reappear. But the street stayed ordinary, indifferent. I returned home quickly, the apartment door slamming softly behind me. I leaned against it, trying to steady my breathing, listening for anything that would explain what had just happened. There was nothing, only the quiet hum of the building settling, the familiar creak of pipes. Even later, lying in bed, I kept imagining her under that streetlight, and I knew that nothing outside had changed. The street was unchanged, ordinary, quiet, yet the memory of her presence lingered, pressing against the edges of my mind in a way that made sleep impossible. I don't know if she had ever been there at all, or if the street had simply tricked me into believing it. But I know that somewhere in the memory of that night, she had existed, patient and still, leaving everything around her untouched. And the silence that followed her disappearance was heavier than it had any right to be. I remember the moment clearly, though it doesn't make much sense even now. I was walking down the streets long past 1 in the morning, the city quiet but alive in a way that felt almost tangible, like the buildings themselves were breathing. The air was thick with the scent of damp asphalt and something indefinably electric, the way streets smell just before dawn even if nothing has changed. I moved slowly, my hands buried deep in my coat pockets, listening to the echo of my footsteps against the concrete. There was no one else around, no cars, no stray cats, just the distant hum of streetlights and the occasional whisper of a loose sign swaying in a faint breeze. The night felt dense, heavy, but not suffocating, more like a pause, a holding of breath. Then it happened. I didn't notice it at first, not consciously. The city seemed to sigh, a subtle shift in the air that made the buildings lean back just slightly, as if releasing a weight they had been carrying for decades. The sound wasn't audible, there was no rushing of wind, no clatter of shutters, but the change was undeniable. The way the air felt on my skin, the way the shadows stretched differently across the pavement, the faint vibration beneath my shoes, it was all part of the same exhale. I stopped walking for a moment, unsure what to make of it. It wasn't wind, it wasn't sound, and yet I felt it everywhere at once, in the corners of the streets, along the walls, even in the empty windows that reflected nothing but darkness. The city itself had shifted, relaxed, and it left me with a strange, hollow sort of calm that didn't entirely reach my chest. I continued walking, cautiously at first, testing whether the feeling would vanish or intensify. Each step echoed differently now, softer somehow, almost muffled, like the space around me had expanded and yet pressed in at the same time. The streetlights flickered faintly, long shadows stretching behind me, but there was no one else to cast them. I felt both exposed and protected at once, the way you do when the world feels larger than you are but still contained. My pulse was steady, my breath shallow, and I noticed how every small sound, the creak of a distant shutter, the scrape of my shoe against a crack in the pavement, was magnified by the emptiness. Somewhere ahead, a corner dipped into shadow, and I felt a pull toward it, not fear, not exactly, just curiosity tinged with unease. The exhale of the city seemed to guide me forward, as if the streets themselves were coaxing me along, testing my awareness, my patience, my willingness to notice. I walked on, keeping my eyes alert to every detail. The pavement underfoot was dry, though faintly warm, and the alleyways seemed just slightly narrower, more deliberate, yet nothing obstructed my path. It was as if the city was breathing around me, shaping itself subtly without ever changing in ways I could point to. I passed windows that reflected the street but not me, walls that held shadows that didn't belong, and streetlights that flickered in patterns too irregular to be natural. The exhale had left a residue, a quiet tension that thrummed under my skin. At some point I stopped counting my steps, stopped trying to measure distance or time. None of it made sense anymore, but I kept walking because the night demanded it, because the city itself seemed to expect it. The air felt alive, thick with possibility and expectation, and every breath I drew felt heavier and lighter at once. I passed familiar storefronts, corners I'd turned 100 times, and yet tonight they looked different, subtly altered, softened by the release of whatever the city had been holding in. Closed the door behind me, and leaned against it, the air inside was ordinary again. Still, in the back of my mind, I could feel it, the exhale, quiet but persistent, as if the city had left a piece of itself walking with me, patient and unseen, waiting for the next night.